Good morning. Thank you for joining today's Appeon community webinar. Today's community webinar will focus on a new feature of PowerBuilder 2017 R2. Specifically, we'll be focusing on the REST interoperability and JSON parsing and generation capabilities of PowerBuilder 2017 R2. Today's presentation will be done by Bruce Armstrong, Appeon MVP, and community volunteer. Before we get started, I did wanted to share with you that this is a community presentation, so it's on a volunteer basis, and just please keep in mind that Appeon is not making any warranties with respect to what is said during this presentation. During the presentation, you can feel free to ask questions at any time. There's no need to wait till the end. Just expand the webinar console, as shown in the screenshot, and go ahead and answer as many questions as you have. In case we don't answer your question during the webinar, we will answer it via email after. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce Armstrong, and he'll take it away.
So first we're going to go over the agenda. What we're going to do is, first we're going to talk about me a little bit, who I am, who I work for, why you might want to listen to what I have to say about PowerBuilder. Then we'll have an introduction to REST. Then we'll talk about the RESTClient object. That is the object that's used to retrieve data from a REST web service into the data window. Then we'll talk about HTTPClient, JSONGenerator, and JSONParser. This is some of the objects we can use, at least in R2, to do updates to a REST service from a data window. And then we'll have questions and answers. So first, a little bit about me. I think most people on this webcast probably know who I am already. I've been around for a long time talking about PowerBuilder. Back in the Team PowerSoft days, through Team Sybase, through SAP Mentor, and now Appeon MVP. It largely means I spend a lot of time in forums, news groups, writing blog articles, writing technical articles for magazines, for doing webcasts like this, just telling people about how to use PowerBuilder. So that's enough about me. My company is Integrated Data Services. They got started in 1997. I didn't join them until 2004. Before that, I was an independent contractor doing PowerBuilder work. When I joined this company, they had been in operation for 7 years already, marketing a client-server tool, a product written in PowerBuilder. We've actually migrated away from that for the most part into HTML5 JavaScript. But we do have a few customers who prefer to use the client-server app, and so we are still doing PowerBuilder work. That's enough about that. So we're going to take a look at this new REST capability that was added to 2017 R2. And to do that, we're going to use a REST web service called JSON placeholder. Now, there's a couple of reasons I wanted to use this particular service. The big one is that it doesn't require that you create any kind of an account. You don't have to authenticate against this. Its methods are just out there available for you to use. Now, in order to make that work, the way they do it is you can do a get, and that's basically a retrieve from the REST web service, and you'll get data back. But the remaining methods, post, put patch, post is insert, put patch is update, and delete, which is delete. You can send the methods, and it will return codes indicating that what you did worked, but they don't actually do anything to the site's data, because you couldn't have hundreds of people all hitting the same data, screwing it up, basically. So the data is actually read-only in this service. But what it does is it's a great tool for testing out a web service client, and then that's exactly what we're going to do. Something else I'll note is REST web services, according to the protocol, they can return data in any internet MIME encodable format. They can return XML, JSON, a zip file, anything you can MIME encode, they can return. However, the vast majority of them use JSON to return the data. And that's actually the only data that's supported by the RESTClient object in PowerBuilder 2017 R2. Okay, so let's look at RESTClient. It's the primary mechanism to get data window to use a REST web service. Right now, it only supports retrieve. They are looking at adding other update methods to that for R3. The data set, if you're going to use the REST client to get data into a data window, then the data needs to be coming back in a simple array. If you've got data coming back in a complex nested structure, what you're going to have to use is the HTTPClient and parse the data out, and then put it into the data window. And we're actually going to see both of these techniques. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull a list of posts from the JSON placeholder site. Now, unlike the REST client that was added to an earlier version of PowerBuilder, Appeon isn't going to try to construct objects by pulling the web service through to figure out what it returns and creating the objects for you. What you're going to have to do, at least for the data window, is you're going to have to go ahead and create the data window manually. So we're going to create an external source data window, and then we're going to put columns in it that match the data elements that we're expecting back from the service. So this is what the data looks like coming back from the JSON placeholder site. So as a user ID, which is numeric, an ID value, which is numeric, a title, which is just random text, and a body, which is an even larger block of random text. So 4 fields, 2 numeric, 2 character. So we're going to create a data window that has 4 columns, user ID, title, and body, of type number, string, and string. And I just made them both 4,000. So that's what my data window looks like. So this is what it looks like when we're going to retrieve the data window. we create a REST client, and then we just say rest.retrieve, give it the data window that's got our external source data window in it, and the URL to do the retrieve. Okay? And there's actually an optional argument out here where you can pass arguments if the method requires arguments. And that's all there is to it. Okay, so you get data back, and let's shift over to a virtual machine and see what that actually looks like. So here is an app where I've got a bunch of different features of 2017 R2 demonstrated. This is the one that handles REST. So there's our external source data window, and I've got some buttons over here. This is the REST client. And that's that same sample code you saw earlier. So just 3 lines of code there. Let's go ahead and run this. Hit REST client, and boom, we got our data. And that was actually pretty quick. Okay? So that's what that looks like. Go back to the slides for a minute. Okay. Just so you know, there's some additional properties that we didn't use here that in this code, but are available. Two of the properties, there's also some other methods, but 2 of the properties are the secure protocol, which means you can specify whether it's one of the SSL standards or one of the TLS standards that is used. I left it the default, which is 0, which means just figure out what protocol the service is using and match it. So I can't think of too many places where you might have to set that. The 0 should probably work for you most of the time. The second value is the timeout, and this indicates how long we're going to wait for the REST service to return data. It defaults to 60 seconds. You can set it to 0, which means timeout, no timeout. And there's some REST client methods we didn't use here. If you want to do things like set basic authentication headers, this is where you would do that. So there's actually three variations of the method. There's a get request headers, set request headers, and clear request headers. And there's also non-plural versions of those methods. And I just summarized them right there. There's a get response status code, which will tell you what message was sent back from the REST service. Anything in the 200 range is usually considered a success. 300 range means you were redirected. 400 range means there's a client error. 500 range means there was a server error. And the particular codes of interest are, for us, are going to be 200, 201, and 202. We're going to use those when we get to the HTTPClient object, which has these same methods. And there's the get response status text, which is basically just the text that goes along with that response code. Okay, so that was it. That was as easy as pie to retrieve data from a REST web service. Now, we're going to look at, well, what happens if the data was more complex? And this is where we're going to use the HTTPClient, the JSONGenerator, and the JSONParser. First thing we're going to do is retrieve that same data. We're going to do that same retrieve, but we're going to do it with the HTTPClient instead. And rather than going through the code here on the slides, let's go back to the virtual machine. Okay. So here's my retrieve for my using the HTTP client. So I'm going to create the HTTP client. I'm going to do a send request using the get method. Now there's 5 HTTP verbs. There's only 4 that are generally used: get, post, patch, and delete. So usually a retrieve is a get. It's a protocol. REST is a protocol. They can mix these up. I know in some of the services we've done, we tend to use just get and post. So we get to retrieve, and we post to send any kind of an update. We don't use the delete method. So that's, so you just need to figure out, based on the documentation they provide for the service, what method you need to use here. And then here's that same URL. But here's where we're going to check the response status code. So we're going to check to see if that response status code is 200. If it is, I'm going to get the response body. So that's the JSON coming back. Okay. Now I should probably have exited at this routine at this point if it wasn't 200. So this is just demo code. So now I'm going to create a JSON parser, and I'm going to load the JSON data that we got back into the JSON parser. I'm going to get the root item, and then I'm going to get the child count. That's the number. The root item has within it, in this response, the array of data. And the child count tells me how many rows I have. I'm going to reset the data window so it doesn't have any rows of data, so it doesn't have any data in it. I'm now going to loop through from 1 to the count I got here earlier for the number of rows of data I've got. And I'm going to insert a row into the data window. And this is where I'm going to use the getChildItem method of the JSON parser to get the first row. Then I do getItemNumber and getItemString, just like the data window methods. This is the JSON object, but it's got basically the same named methods. And it's pretty much the same syntax. I'm going to use, this is actually a handle to the child, the record, the row, and then these are the essentially the columns in that row of data. And I just retrieve those using the getItemNumber, and then I use the data window setItem method to set them into the data window. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. And once again, that's pretty fast. I'm not sure I see a whole lot of difference. Bing, 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 bing. You see a little flicker there from the reset, but otherwise I don't see a huge difference between those two methods. So that is the retrieve. And if that's where you could have used a more complex structure and then navigated down through the structure using the JSON parser methods to find the data you want to actually put into the data window. Let's go back to slides for a second. And we'll just skip through this. This is just the same thing. Okay. And I just explained what we did. Check to get status code, get the response body, loop through it. Okay, so that's how we did the retrieve. Now let's see how we can do updates from the REST to the REST web service from the data window using those same objects. And for that, we're going to go back to the virtual machine again. So here we are doing, well, actually, this is doing inserts and deletes just in the data window. And you could just do updates directly. This is the code we're interested in here. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create the HTTPClient object, a JSON generator, and a JSONParser. So it's pretty much the same thing you saw before, except we've got the generator now because we're going to create JSON to send back to the service for the updates. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the number of rows in the data window. I'm going to loop through them and check the item status of each row. Now, if it's new modified or data modified, I know we've got an insert or an update we need to perform. If it's not, then you hit the case else and we just skip the row. That means the status was not modified. Or new, and that just means they didn't change any data, and we don't want to do insert that. So if I've got an inserted or modified row, I'm going to create a new JSON object. And then I'm going to pull values out of the row. What we're doing here is we're grabbing the user ID, the title, and the body. I haven't grabbed the ID yet, and we're going to see why in a minute. So if the status is new modified, that means this is a new row that the user's added. This ID value that I'm not selecting is a sequence value in the database. So I don't want the data window trying to provide that data. I want to send the rest of the data to the service, and it's going to pass me back the ID it assigned to the data. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to do get JSON string from our JSON generator. So now we have the record that we want to send. We're going to do a send request. This time we're going to do a post because that was what was defined as the appropriate verb to use for an insert is a post. And so I'm sending it to that same URL, and I'm sending the data. Now we do a check our status code. Now the status code created, I just defined that up here, means we get a 201 code, not a 200 code, a 201 code. That's the appropriate response you get back from this service if the data was inserted. Okay, so it says if it's inserted, I'm going to get a response body back from the service because it's returning the ID value back to me. I then load that into my JSON parser, get the root item, and then get the ID value that was returned to me. That's the only thing that's returned in the response, is just the new ID value. Okay, that's for the insert. If it wasn't new modified, that means it was data modified, which means it's an update. So now I'm going to go ahead, I've already got those other three values. I'm going to go ahead and get the ID value. But there's two things I'm going to do with it. One is I'm going to add it to the JSON generator, so it's actually part of the data. But the other thing is I'm going to add it to the actual URL that I'm sending, and I'm going to do a put. Now, according to this web service, remember I said a post is an insert and a put is an update. Now the difference here is we've got that base URL, but by the way they've defined it, when you want to update a post, you actually pass the post ID as part of the URL, and that's actually fairly typical. So we are going to once again use the ID value as part of the data, where I'm adding it to the generator and then generating the JSON, which I'm then passing to the service, but I'm also going to add it to the URL. I'm going to check the response status code. The OK is 200, and if I got the 200, that means the update did work. So I keep looping through the data window, looking for inserted and updated rows. When I'm done doing that, okay, you might wonder, well, what about deleted? Well, the reason I'm handling deleted separately is because all those deleted rows are in the deleted buffer, not in the primary buffer. So I'm going to get the deleted count for the data window. I'm going to loop through the deleted count now and get the ID value out of the delete buffer. Okay? Okay, and the only thing I need to pass for a delete, according to the way this service is defined, I need to use the delete method. I give the base URL, and I actually, same thing as I did for the update, is I actually also pass the ID value as part of the URL. There's no data we return. We just call this method, this URL, with the delete method, and that will delete the record. Or, that's what the operation is supposed to do. I check the response status code. Once again, if it's 200, that means it worked. Once I've got done looping through the primary buffer for the inserts and the updates, and the deleted buffer for the deleted records, I do a reset update on the data window, because we've been handling this update manually. The reset update clears those item status flags to indicate we're now back in sync with the data that's in the service. Okay, let's go back to the slides, and we just click through this. This is just that same sample code. Okay, and here's just what I'm also just explaining how that worked. And there's the 200 versus the 201. 201 means the value was inserted. And for deletes, all we have to do is pass the ID value. Okay. So as I mentioned, the REST client had some properties. The HTTP client also has some properties. Actually, there's two of them are the same properties: the secure protocol and the timeout. HTTP client has a couple other properties. Auto read data is defaults to true, which means that it would automatically pull down all the data in one batch, essentially, in one block of data. If you've got a really, really large set of data, you could set this to false. And then there are some methods you would use where you could read the data in chunks instead of as one big block of data. So we get to the methods. That's the same as the REST client, where you've got the ability to set the request headers and the checking of the response status code and the status text. But there's some additional methods, once again. Post data start, post data end. That's for sending large amounts of data in batches rather than in chunks, rather than as one large block. And then read data, which is used to read large amounts of data from REST service in blocks. Okay, that's it for now. This is enough to get us operational with what REST web services, but as you saw, for instance, the data window update, it took a little bit of code to make that work. In PowerBuilder 2017 R3, Appeon is expecting to deliver additional REST functionality that should make this even easier. In particular, what they're looking at is support for authentication protocols, such as OAuth. You could do that today. It would be a bit of coding, and because you would be setting certain headers and calculating hash values. The idea is that they want to provide some methods that make it a lot simpler for you. Support for doing updates directly from the data window through RESTClient rather than having to code it like we did here. And then methods to import and export JSON directly from the data window. eliminating the need to use the JSON parser and generator that we did in this code. So even if we're still going to loop through the rows of the data window and pull out the data, you'd be able to do it a lot easier than what we did in this sample. Okay, it's question and answer time.